Hey everybody, welcome back to my studio. My name's Kris. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I painted this watercolor painting of a boat on the water with its reflection. It's a pretty easy step-by-step tutorial. Let's get started. The reference image that I used to paint this boat and reflection is this picture that you see on my tablet. It's from unsplash.com. I'll have a link in the description below if you'd like to give it a try. I also printed it out as a black and white reference image so I could see the values that I wanted to reproduce. In my first wash, I just paint the medium values that are all over in the water here. And the areas I leave white are the right front of the boat and the back end of the boat. Then I'll come back after that and paint in the darker values. Let's get started. I have my Arches 140-pound cold press paper here, taped down to a board, and I have drawn a contour drawing of the boat shape and a little bit of the ripples below it. I'm not worried about drawing in any of the background, as that will just be a wash with some abstract ripples. Okay, I'm going to mix up my colors for the background. I'm going to be using Cobalt blue here primarily for the background, with maybe a little bit of my French Ultramarine mixed in. Okay, I have a big puddle of my blue color there mixed on my palette, and now with my number 6 Quill Princeton Neptune brush, I'm just applying that wash across the whole background from the top down. Again, I have my board at a slight angle, probably about 30 degrees. And I'm really careful now to paint along the edge of the boat, especially here on the right side, because I want to keep the white highlights that are on this right side of the boat. And so I'm carefully using the tip of the brush to paint around that. And then once I get past that part, I can just paint right across the water and ripples there at the bottom of the boat. Because later that will be painted again with an even darker value, and you won't even see some of this paint that I'm putting down right now. It'll get painted over. And so now I'm just really squinting at my reference image and really trying to identify the main shapes. I'm not worried about details. I'm just trying to get the middle values, again, which is the whole background of the water, and the left side of the boat there on the prow of the boat, all the way down to the very bottom of the piece of paper. That's all medium or middle value at this point. Okay, now I'm going to darken up my blue wash color with a little bit more of the French Ultramarine. And with the fine tip point of my quill brush, I'm going to paint in the interior of the boat, the areas that are the darkest. Again, being very careful to retain the highlights and just paint around those. Seeing that application of paint's a little bit dark, I just take a thirsty brush and come back and lift some of the paint off of those areas, lightening them a little bit. And now I take that same mixture of blue and come back to the prow of the boat on the left-hand side, carefully finding the edges there where I want to have a sharp edge on the very bow of the boat, and painting from there down into the water, emphasizing the ragged edge of the ripples there into the water. Again, darkening up my mixture of paint with my Cobalt blue. And darkening again, once again, just painting wet on wet here. This whole area is still wet from the initial wash. And so any paint that I lay down here with the tip of this Princeton Aqua Elite brush is just going to nicely create a soft edge as it spreads out into the surrounding wash. I want to darken the edge of the water there along the right-hand side of the boat, and just put in a little additional marks of ripples there below the boat. Now I see that there are some shadows cast below these bumpers that are tied to the edge of the boat. So with my mixture of blue, I'm going to come in and emphasize those edges. doing that several places around the edge of the boat where I have these bumpers sticking out. Again, I'm really squinting at the painting at this point, the reference image, and just really trying to identify the main shapes that I see on the boat. Now I've mixed up some burnt umber with my ultramarine blue or French ultramarine. This produces a beautiful gray tone, neutral tone, and I'm going to now emphasize these shadow areas along the back of the boat and along the sides. I'll speed up the video a little bit as I think you get the idea. I'm just identifying each of those dark areas, painting through there. Now I'll come back, mix up even a bit more of the burnt umber and French ultramarine, and really want to emphasize this dark area along the left side of the boat in the bow area. It's very dark where the boat hits the water. I'm still painting wet on wet because you can really see how the paint is dispersing and spreading into the wetness of the paper. And I really want that because I really want a nice soft look to this at this point. Now I'm mixing up some of my Quinacridone burnt orange with my French ultramarine. I want to get a little bit more of an orange color, which will represent the wood in this part of the boat. And I've mixed that up. It's still a very dark value, and I'm painting around, again, the edges of the boat where the wood of the boat is very evident. I speed up the video here just a little bit. When I get to these parts of the video where it's somewhat repetitious, I think you get the idea. You can see what I'm doing here, painting the wood around the edges and on the seat in the middle of the boat. Now there's a little bit of wood evident right down the center of the bow, so I'm putting that in as well, but I'm being very careful to not paint that white line, which represents the rope that comes from the bow into the water in front of the boat. So again, taking my mixture of burnt umber and French ultramarine, I am now applying a bit more emphasis to the shadows that are cast to the lower side of these bumpers that are interspersed all along the edge of the boat. Now I'm taking my mixture with mostly ultramarine, French ultramarine, and I'm emphasizing the edge of the boat along the water with a nice dark line there. And now I see these very dark lines along the edge of the ripple. And I'm taking a very thick mixture of the French ultramarine. Again, I'm still painting wet on wet. The paper is still a little bit damp, so I have to be careful. If I have too much water in my brush at this point, it will create back runs or cauliflowers, and I don't want that. So I've got mostly pigment, mostly paint in my brush at this point, and I'm able to apply it here. It'll still spread out a little bit, but it won't really create a back run because there's very little water in the brush. Again, I'm using a Princeton Aqua Elite brush with a very fine point to it. Now I want to move from the ripples near the boat out to the water that's here in the lower right part of the picture. I'm going to take my Princeton Aqua Elite brush and I'm just going to take the edge of the brush, again with quite a bit of pigment in the brush, but not too much water, and just try to emphasize these wave shapes that I see near the front of the painting. The closer these ripples and waves get to the foreground, the larger they are, whereas in a little bit when we paint the far distant background, you're going to see I use a lot smaller wave and reflections by using a different kind of brush stroke. Okay, as I evaluate the painting at this point, I feel like I'm pretty close to being done with the first wash. I'm just going to finish up these ripples here in the foreground, and then I'm going to let the painting dry completely before I go on to the next step, where I will be darkening the values. Okay, now it's time to take back my number 6 quill brush. This is a Princeton Neptune brush. I have mixed up more of my cobalt blue, a real light blue, and taking the edge of the brush, I'm just quickly bringing it across the paper there from the top down. So I'm dealing now with just the ripples that are the farthest away. I don't want to create a real strong sense of line in this portion of the painting. I just want an impression of ripples and sunlight glistening off the water. And many times the best way to do that is with a dry brush approach. Now, as I move closer to the foreground, I'm starting to take the tip of the brush and make the waves and individual ripples a little bit more distinct, again, by using the tip of the brush. Now, as I look at the ripples that I've put down so far, they're all pretty much monotone and all the same color. And so what I'm going to do next is mix up a darker wash of my French Ultramarine, a little bit of Cobalt blue, and come back and create some variety in the colors of these ripples and waves. Because if you look closely at the reference image, all of those, the backside of those little waves, the dark side, they're not all the same color. In fact, there's a lot of variation in the color. So I need to be careful to create that. It's going to give it a more realistic look to it. So I'm taking, again, my blue, and I'm darkening it here even more. I'm taking a bit richer color of the French Ultramarine and just with the tip of my quill brush, just touching into these areas that are already wet. Because they're already wet, that paint, that dark pigment is going to just charge into these areas that already are wet and just really disperse into a really beautiful mixture of color. Now I've switched to my Princeton Aqua Elite brush. This is a little bit stiffer of a brush, gives me more control, taking my darkest blue and coming in really darkening that area right below the left side of the boat. Now it's interesting to note that because I'm now putting such a dark value there in the water, the area of the boat above that, which used to look really dark, now by contrast, in relative value, doesn't look quite as dark. And again, we must have to realize, keep in mind always, that all values that we place on the paper are all relative to the other values that they are close to. So while an area of paint might look real dark when you first put it down, later on when you come back with a darker value, it's going to really change its relative value in the rest of the painting. Now I'm continuing with my Princeton Aqua Elite brush and my dark blue, and I'm just darkening these areas below the boat. This is really one of the most important parts of the painting. It's where the darkest values meet up against the lightest values. And that is always, that area of contrast is always where the eye is drawn in a painting. And so it's very important that you get these areas right. I'm paying a lot of attention here to the details around the bow of the boat and where the boat meets the water. Now the areas I'm painting here are effectively all dry, and so I'm able to take my darkest value with a fine-tipped brush, just go and put lots of little detail there around the bumpers in the corner of the boat, at the bow, and just kind of finish up this portion of the painting. So I walked away from my painting, actually left it overnight, 24 hours, came back to it, and I was able to see the painting with fresh eyes. One thing I noticed is that the reflection of the front of the boat, as it reflects down into the water here, has a little bit of a yellowish tone. So I decided to take some transparent iron oxide, which has a yellow hint to it, and paint the front right of the boat really lightly with a little bit of a yellowish tint, and then carry that down into the water. And that really gives a sense of where that part of the boat is reflecting in the water. I think this added a lot to it. I take some water and just soften the edge of that yellow area. Now take a bit more of that same color and even apply it there to the very back end of the boat. And I think this helps distinguish those parts of the boat in contrast to other pure white areas, such as the bumpers that are attached to the boat and some of the other details like the rope. In evaluating the painting at this point, I feel like I'm close to being done. I want to be careful not to overwork the painting. It's always important knowing when to stop. I mix up some of my darkest color again. It's that French Ultramarine and burnt umber, and I'm adding just slight little details here and there. Now I'm going to take that same color and add my signature to the lower right of the painting, and I'm going to call this one done. So there you have it, a boat on the water with its reflection, a somewhat impressionist painting where I haven't tried to emphasize the details too much, but have focused on big shapes and values to give the sense of my subject matter. I hope you've enjoyed this one. If so, consider subscribing. I try to put a painting out like this every week. Thanks for watching. See you next time.